wanna go home. I got to go home. Let me go home.
The rights to freedoms include protection against forced evictions and the arbitrary destruction and demolition of one's home, the right to be free from arbitrary interference with one's home, privacy, and family, the right to choose one's residence, to determine where to live, and to freedom of movement. Entitlements include security of tenure, housing, land, and property restitution, equal and non-discriminatory access to adequate housing, participation in housing-related decision-making at the national and community levels. Eviction should not result in individuals becoming homeless or vulnerable to further human rights violations. Yet, still each year, according to the United Nations, millions of people are forcibly evicted and left homeless. If you are given a piece of paper at the beginning of this presentation, please open it now and follow the instructions on it. This is to illustrate on an extremely nominal level the uncomfortable and degrading situation millions of people around the world experience each day for no fault of their own.
So hello, I'm Michelle Biss. I'm the Legal Education and Outreach Coordinator here at Canada Without Poverty, and I'm a human rights lawyer.
My name is Laura Neidhart. I'm the Development and Communications Coordinator at Canada Without Poverty, and I have a academic background in human rights.
Could you please tell us about how adequate housing does not necessarily mean just four walls and a roof?
Right. Well, the right to housing means so much more than a physical space, right? It means security of tenure. It means cultural appropriateness. It means making sure that housing is accessible for persons with disabilities. So it means so much more. It's not just having a physical space. And the thing too about housing is home, right? It's where you create your identity, where you rest your head at night, where you feel safe, where you can comfortably look for employment or go home to after employment. So it means so much more than a physical space, both individually and in terms of what the right to housing is.
Could you please tell us about the key documents and their provisions pertaining to the right to adequate housing in international human rights law?
Yeah, well, there's quite a few. What a lot of people don't realize is that the Universal Declaration has a reference to the right to housing, which is, one of the biggest key pieces. There's Article 25 of the Declaration. We also have the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which Canada ratified in 1976. And there it's really explicit, especially in Article 11, really, really clear that that we have a right to housing. We have an obligation to uphold that right to housing. There's also a number of covenants for marginalized groups. So for example, the Covenant on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which Canada ratified in 2010, the Covenant on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Covenant on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and all of these covenants actually do have explicit reference to an adequate standard of living, and in particular, the right to housing.
Could you please tell us about the key documents at the regional level that protect the right to adequate housing?
So some constitutional documents do explicitly protect the right to housing. And some of them protect the right to housing by interpretation of other clauses within the Constitution. Canada, for example, is one that does not explicitly recognize the right to housing in the language of our Constitution, but technically, we are supposed to be a country that interprets things like Section 7, which is the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and Section 15, which is equality rights in terms of the right to housing, other international human rights related to economic and social rights. In some countries, you can exercise those rights really clearly through what we call justiciability, right? You can go to a courtroom and say that your right to housing has been violated. In a number of Latin American countries, South Africa, India, there's a lot of case examples where you can see people actually accessing the right to housing or other economic and social rights using documents like their constitution.
Could you please tell us about the link between the right to adequate housing and other human rights?
It's laid out pretty clearly in the ICESCR that it's along with an adequate standard of living, and that's where we get a lot of the other pieces like the right to food. But it is also pretty clearly, if you look at the experience of homelessness and housing insecurity, we can clearly see that there is an overlap between the right to housing with the right to health, the right to work, the right to life in a lot of situations, especially when we're talking about people having to live on the streets in Toronto during the winter. Things like education and childcare and making sure that people have income security are all pieces that the right to housing doesn't exist kind of on its own.
Could you please speak on the common misconception that the right to adequate housing requires a state to build housing for the entire population?
Yeah, so that's a common misconception. And understanding housing from a human rights perspective is that we don't have to decide what that means. We have authorities at the United Nations, treaty bodies, special rapporteurs, other individuals and mechanisms that have really gone deep into interpreting what those rights mean, what the limit of those rights mean, and how far they go. And quite simply, it's so clear in international human rights law that that does not mean that, that the government must provide a physical house for every individual. What it does mean is that they have an obligation to work with communities to create solutions. They have a responsibility to create an accountability mechanism to ensure that people have access to those rights and some sort of response from the government if those rights aren't being met. And it means, the different elements of a right to housing. So like I mentioned, the security of tenure, culturally appropriate housing, space that is accessible for persons with disabilities. That's what the right to housing means. It does mean to ensure that there is adequate housing, but it does not mean to physically build a space for every individual.
Could you please talk about the obligations of the United Nations and United Nations agencies in relation to the right to adequate housing?
So a couple of parameters are set up by the United Nations in terms of the right to housing as well as other economic and social rights. One is this idea of progressive realization. It's taking small steps forward, but always moving forward towards the larger goal of ending homelessness or ending poverty. So that's a really key piece of what those limitations are, but it also means that we have a responsibility to ensure that a maximum of available resources are put towards those obligations. And so for a wealthy country like Canada, that means that when our social spending as compared to our, as a percentage of our gross domestic product is at its lowest rate since 1949, clearly we're not doing so great in terms of maximum of available resources.
Could you please tell us about some monitoring the right to adequate housing and holding states accountable?
Well, there's a couple of different mechanisms. There's the international mechanisms. Different pieces within the United Nations that review our adherence to those rights. There's the Special Procedures Wing of the United Nations and special rapporteurs. There is the political bodies within the UN, so groups like the Human Rights Council, who conduct reviews like the Universal Periodic Review. And we also have treaty body reviews. So for each of those covenants that we've signed, we have treaty bodies who review our adherence. There's also different ways that we can implement and monitor these rights domestically. Through the courts, potentially, through interpretation of the Charter, although that can be a little bit iffy. We also create implementation by things like the federal budget, for example, is a way that we implement human rights.
You mentioned special repertoires before. Could you please tell us a little bit about that in relation to adequate housing?
One of the neat things about Canada Without Poverty is that our executive director, Leilani Farha, is also the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing. She's had that mandate since 2014. And what special rapporteurs are responsible for doing, one thing is that they do thematic reports to really suss out what each of these rights means. So for the Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, Leilani has conducted reports on what the right to housing means for subnational government, so for local government. She's developed a report on what homelessness really means and what the right to housing means in terms of homelessness, what it means in terms of the right to life. And she's really dug deep into what exactly these rights mean. The other thing that special rapporteurs can do is they can conduct country visits where they go into countries all over the world and they assess. They meet with civil society organizations, they meet with governments and determine just how well they're complying with their international human rights obligations vis-a-vis the right to housing. And they, of course, develop a report at the end of those visits. There's also individual complaints mechanisms where people can speak about systemic issues with the right to housing that they've seen, and the special rapporteur can take a role of writing a communication to a government, they call it, where the government is required to respond on what they're actually doing in terms of that issue vis-a-vis the right to housing.
With all that being said, could you please tell us about how Canada is doing on the issue of right to adequate housing?
Mouloud Kathari came to visit Canada to do a mission with us in 2007, so we're actually on the 10-year anniversary of that. And what he said about housing and homelessness in Canada at the time was that given our wealth, it was at a national crisis level. Since then, we haven't really done too much, particularly on the national level, to address the housing insecurity and homelessness crisis that is happening. So something that Leilani has focused on a lot as Special Rapporteur is the financialization of housing, which we've seen in cities like Vancouver and Toronto, where the market is kind of going through this experience of skyrocketing rents and mortgages, and people are being cut out of access to housing for a lot of reasons. So in light of that, there hasn't been a lot of national leadership on the right to housing in particular in the last 10 years. However, what is happening now is that the government has announced that they will be making a national housing strategy. We are hopeful that it will recognize housing as a human right.
This is Christina. Christina is currently living on the streets of Ottawa, and this is her story.
My name is Christina Dufour. I'm 4 months pregnant. I've been homeless now for 4 months. My main issue is not enough housing. Not a lot of these renters do even want to rent to people on disability, welfare, or that are coming off the streets. I've been refused for homelessness. I went to view an apartment yesterday, and they said if I marked down homeless, I'd be denied for my application for a unit. So that's discrimination, first of all. Other places, they're either too expensive or they're out of reach. We need more housing. We definitely need more housing buildings, and safe ones that are, meant for just families and children, because when they start mixing people with the drugs and stuff, that's when these buildings don't work. The city has hotel rooms they place people in for emergencies if the shelters are full. They haven't done anything, they're too full. All the shelters are packed. The Shepherds is the only shelter that I'm available to stay at, and it's not a safe place. The rate of Aboriginal people out on the street is brutal. Myself, I'm full status, and I have no help from either my government for disability or my status. There's just so many homeless people out here. Like, people think that streets are empty. Being homeless, I have met over 300 people now, probably sleeping outside. Some have cancer and are dying. They need to give us more funding, and if they gave people like the rent supplement, we'd be able to afford to get into places. That's our main issue for people that are on disability and welfare, is that we're not supplemented. So we get $4.90 for rent. That's it. Now, when you're pregnant and you have a spouse, that's really hard to even just get in anywhere. I've been stuck in rooming houses for the last 3 years, and I just gave it up because they wouldn't do anything about the rats or cockroaches. And some people don't want to go into housing either, because a lot of these housing buildings are infested and they won't do anything. So the main issues are them not giving an adequate supply of money so we can afford them, and there's not enough housing. There just isn't enough units. There's nothing for me.